When my wife and I were in our 30s, we moved to Silicon Valley. It's just a few miles south of here, about an hour drive by car. And we didn't expect it, but we ended up living there for 14 years. And during that time, I made a study of Silicon Valley culture, read tons of books, met lots of Silicon Valley pioneers, and I really studied the influence that that small region had on the entire world and what it means to be a modern person today. Recently, I've been reading this book by Malcolm Harris. It's called Palo Alto, A History of Capitalism, of California, Capitalism in the World. And it studies many of the same things that had been interesting me for years. He begins by talking about the 1849, the discovery of gold in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and about how we used industrial techniques like hydraulic mining techniques to wash out every ounce of gold out of the mountains, and the destructiveness that caused both in the mountains and then in the bay, where there's so much mercury and there's so many tailings from mines. There's still an issue for us even 150 years later. He writes about industrial agriculture practices. He writes about the founding of Stanford. I hadn't realized this, but he believes firmly that the first president of Stanford actually poisoned the main benefactor, Mrs. Leland Stanford herself. And then he writes about the emergence of radio and the importance of radio in the 1920s in Northern California, and the discovery of radar too, and the work that was done in technologies that were around wartime, all having to do with creating the avionics systems that airplanes rely on in order to be able to function. He writes about the horrors of World War II, about massive bombing attacks that were implemented in Dresden and London and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how terrifying these were, how unique in all of history they were, and how our response to it was to begin to build intercontinental ballistic missiles that would carry nuclear weapons thousands and thousands of miles away, and how these suburbs were built by the money that was expended to create these horrible weapons. So behind what looks like a simple suburb, there is this much bigger story, a story of human sinfulness, a story of suffering. And even today, the chip manufacturers, the computers that we built in order to build the nuclear weapons, they're just as important as nuclear fission. In order to build a nuclear weapon, you have to have a computer. They led to the development of the integrated circuit industry, and Intel and Cisco and Hewlett-Packard, and more modern and recent companies like Google and Facebook. All of these also had the effect of changing this class structure of the United States, so that it's so much harder to be a middle-class person than it was before, as these companies have changed the way that we do business with each other. They also have important implications for overseas work, like offshoring and the misuse of workers in faraway countries, and the horrible working conditions that they are under. And what it reminds me of is that behind the facade of our society, there are these horrible things that are not immediately obvious to us. I've also been reading Jill Lepore's book, These Truths. It's a one-volume history of American life. And it's tremendously important for all of us who received an education in history more than 20 years ago to study what history looks like now, that we understand better how race has been such a central component to the American story from the very beginning, that this terrible racism that treated human beings like property, in every generation it looks different, but in every generation it continues on as a thread that goes and connects us to the very beginnings of the country. Now many people, when they talk about sin, think about indiscretion, sexual indiscretions, or not getting angry at somebody in your household. But sin is so much more than an individual affair. Sin is a whole system of dehumanization that we all participate in. We all inherit it. We all perpetuate it in our own ways. And I wish people could understand that idea of sin, because then it would help us to understand it better, and it would also help us to understand how we can begin to be agents of love and healing in our lives and in the institutions that are around us. And that's the good news. The good news is not that we're not trapped in these impersonal systems and impersonal experiences of evil and violence. We also are loved by God. And as children of God, we have the chance to care for each other and to improve the world that we found and inherited. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Thanks for watching. More good news.